Well, friends, have that last section, Hebrews 11, open, please, as we look at this little section here. And as we do so, I want to remind you, first of all, before we get into these verses, I want to remind you of two things that are important to our understanding of this passage, but as we come to the end of this series of studies, I want to remind you, first of all, why this chapter was written, why the writer of Hebrews included this great catalogue of examples of faith at this particular point in the letter. These heroes and heroines, some of whom were named, of course, but many not. We need to go back, because we have once or twice the end of chapter 10. And let me remind you that this congregation of believers is struggling, their Jewish background, and having become Christians, they're now discovering that life isn't quite as easy as they thought it was going to be, and as they remembered once being. And so they're tempted to go back into Judaism, and they look back into Judaism, into the Old Testament, and to their past lives with those sort of rose-tinted spectacles, and think life was easier, life was a bit more comfortable. Perhaps the best thing now is just to go back. Let's go back to what we used to have before. And so the writer is writing the letter to Hebrews to remind them that what they now have in Christ is infinitely superior to and better than anything they had under the old dispensation. And so he says in verse 39 of chapter 10, we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. That's a very important truth, even in that one verse. Is that the reality of our faith is proven by the fact that we persevere. Okay? If we shrink back, we prove that we were not truly saved to start with, and we are destroyed. We shrink back and are destroyed, but the true believers are those who have faith, and they preserve their souls because they persevere to the end. And then, as a great communicator and with a pastoral heart, he's thinking to himself, as it were, under the inspiration of the Spirit, how can I illustrate this? How can I put flesh on the bones of this important truth that real faith, genuine faith, always perseveres? So he writes chapter 11. Remember, there are no chapter divisions in the original version. He writes chapter 11 to give this list of all these people that these Hebrew believers would know very well from all the stories they grew up with and learned in the synagogue and all the rest of it. I say, these great heroes that you revere and hold in such high esteem, the one thing they all have in common is they had faith, and they lived by faith, and they persevered in faith. So that's the example you need to follow. So he's reinforcing that particular teaching. Here's the second thing we need to remind ourselves at this stage, is we need to remind ourselves what this chapter has taught us about what faith is. And let me remind you, faith is my response to God's revelation. God speaks, I believe him, and I act accordingly, I obey. So faith is an action. It's taken in response to God's word. And we point out numerous times, all the examples of faith that we worked through in this chapter, it's all about doing something. They did something. So you go all the way back to verse 4, for example. By faith, Abel offered. By faith, Enoch, when he was taken up because he walked in faith with God. Down in verse 7, by faith Noah constructed an ark. Verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed, and so on. It's all action words. Faith is not primarily something you have. Faith is something you do because you are in a right relationship with God. Then we come to these last verses of this great chapter. And actually, in one sense, we've been in this little section for 6 or 7 weeks because we've been looking at these individual characters. And after mentioning a few individuals, all of whom we've looked at except Samuel, he then refers to broader general experiences rather than individuals. Now, I wonder if you notice, there are two categories of names in these verses. And we're going to divide up in this way tonight. Verse 33 to the first half of 35 is about great victories gained by faith. And then 35b through to 38 is great suffering endured by faith. And that's an important truth. There are two sides to the same coin here. The first half of those are pictures, even on a human level, of triumph and victory and success. The second half of that little section, the world will look on and say, well, there's defeat for you. And yet the right saying, no, what seems to be defeat is actually just as victorious as the previous one. We'll look at that in a moment. And then, of course, he comes to the closing, astonishing statement in 39:40 that we'll come to in a few moments. So let me take you briefly through this list of events in 35 to 38 in particular. Thrilling, humbling summary of much of Old Testament history, and then we'll draw out some of the practical lessons that are there for us today. But here again we learn a very important lesson. That God, with all these characters we looked at, all these different personalities and circumstances, God doesn't always work in the same way. But He always uses the same means. Faith. Okay? And if you remember, go back to verse 6 of the chapter, without faith, it is impossible to please Him. One thing you have to be careful, just take a very slight sidestep here for a moment before we get back into this text. One thing we have to be very careful is when we, for example, share our testimony, talk about how God's dealt with us. Not just when we came to faith in Christ, but other times in our lives. We need to be very careful to stress that this is how God dealt with me, but that's not how God deals with everybody. God very rarely works in the same way in two different people. But He always works using the same means. So we need to stress, and I'm sure you've heard testimonies that are very dramatic or very exciting. You thought, well, that didn't happen to me, therefore maybe I'm not saved, for example. Or something lacking in my life. No, God doesn't always work in the same way, but He always uses the same means, which is faith. That's an important lesson we need to learn. So let's look then, first of all, at great victories gained by faith, verses 33 to 35. We'll just look at the references here, and let's remind ourselves of who these are speaking to. So we're told that these heroes and heroes of the faith, through faith, all of these things they did through faith, they first of all conquered kingdoms. We've seen that already. In the series, we've seen that Gideon against the Midianites, Barak against the Canaanites, Jephthah against the Ammonites, Samson against the Philistines, David against many nations, as well as, of course, Israel entering Canaan under Joshua all those years ago. All of that was accomplished by faith. They took God at His word, they obeyed God, and they conquered kingdoms. They overcame sometimes kingdoms that were much bigger and stronger and more militarily resourced than they were. So they conquered kingdoms. They enforced justice is the second thing in this list. It's interesting, as a parallel to something we looked at this morning, I think if you have Navy, it says they wrought righteousness. See, because these men and women were men and women of faith, for all their failures and all their flaws, they sought to rule the people under the righteous hand of God. They sought to order things under God's law and by God's standards. So that's what made them judges. Think of Elijah and his contest with the prophets of Baal. What really riled Elijah was that these people were claiming to be worshipping another God equal to or more powerful than Yahweh. And that filled Elijah with a furious, righteous indignation. We're told in 2 Samuel 8 about David when he became king. David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Now it's interesting, the word again here in the ESV the word justice, but it's the same word that elsewhere the Bible translates as righteousness. Remember, those of you here this morning, we looked at Joseph in Matthew chapter 1. Joseph was a just man. What it really says is Joseph was a righteous man. He was in a right relationship with God. Indeed, he was just because he was righteous. So I'm not questioning he was just, but the reason he was just is because he was righteous. And again, let's remember here, much of this period of history was at the time when we're told in the book of Judges, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But among them there were these men and women of faith who wrought righteousness, who were jealous for the things of God and for the laws of God. It's an encouragement to us. We feel sometimes that those of us who are serious about God and the Word of God and the standards of God, we feel sometimes we're battling against a larger number out there. We're being overwhelmed almost by professing Christians and churchgoers who say, we don't need to take this thing so seriously now. But God looks with favour on those who are zealous for righteousness. What's right in the eyes of God. So they conquered kingdoms, they enforced justice. Thirdly, we're told here they obtained promises. Now we'll see at the end of this chapter, this does not include the ultimate promise. But in different situations, God assured His people and gave them promises, and by faith the people received those promises. So Joshua 21:45, as they surveyed the conquest of the land at that stage, not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to to pass. Every specific promise God made to Joshua and the people, every single one was fulfilled. When Solomon built his great temple, in 1 Kings 8, the great prayer of dedication, he says this: "Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, according to all that he promised. Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he spoke by Moses his servant." What a testimony to God, isn't it? Not one word of his promises has failed. God is a promise-keeping God, and every one of his promises he keeps to the letter. So they obtained promises. Then we're told they stopped, we're at the end of verse 33 here, they stopped the mouths of lions. Now, I suspect when I remind you of that, maybe first thing comes to mind is Daniel, of course, thrown into the lion's den. And he said, "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me." Notice here, by the way, the lions were not killed, they stopped the mouths of lions. In some ways, that's a bigger miracle than simply killing the lion, rendering the lion powerless, if you like, incapable of harming God's people. But Daniel wasn't the only one. David and Samson also killed individual lions. And there are wonderful examples here of the protecting power of God towards his faithful sons. As they're being obedient to walking in righteousness, God protects them from danger. Then we're told the next example, at the beginning of 34, is they quench the power of the fire. Notice again, by the way, the flames weren't quenched. The power of the flames were quenched. It'd be fairly easy to put the fire out. The greater miracle is to protect them in the midst of the fire. I suppose, most obviously, Daniel's three friends come for us to mind you. They refused to take part in their idolatrous worship commanded by the king, and they knew full well what the circumstances would be. They were threatened with the fire. But nonetheless, they said, "No, we will be faithful to our God. We will be faithful to our God." I think of that promise of God through Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you, for I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Saviour." So they quenched the power of fire. Then they escaped the edge of the sword. We could list a number of examples from the Old Testament. David delivered from Saul, for example, on numerous occasions. Elijah delivered from Jezebel. Jeremiah delivered from King Jehoiakim. And so the list goes on. Then we're told they were made strong out of weakness. They became mighty in war and put foreign armies to flight. It's a reminder to us here, friends, that the strength that these men and women exhibited was not natural physical strength, it was supernatural spiritual strength. So Samson, his strength was not physical, it wasn't in his muscles, it was spiritual and his dependence on God. Gideon accomplished a great victory over his enemies when he's vastly outnumbered. Hudson Taylor, the great pioneer missionary to China, the founder of what we know today as the ONF, says, "All God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on his being with them." All God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God, not out of their own strength, but because they reckoned on his being with them. And then the last one in this little section, beginning in verse 35, "Women received back their dead by resurrection." Think of Elijah's ministry. The son of a widow that he raised back to life. Think in Jesus' ministry. This is, of course, before the letter to Hebrews. Jesus' ministry, the son of the widow of Nain. Jairus' daughter, raised back to life from the dead. Think even of Paul in his ministry. The raising of that young man Eutychus who fell out of the window and died. All raised him back to life. So there's a whole list of examples here. And of course the point here is that the death, which is the ultimate enemy, therefore resurrection is the ultimate victory. So if they receive back their dead by resurrection, that's even more victorious because it's over the ultimate enemy, which is death. So a great long list. But then you get this change in tone halfway through verse 35 as we have it. And it's such an important change, and I'm so glad this section is here, because we need a reality check at this point. If we just took these verses, we might say, well, here we are, every time we get into trouble, every time there's some danger, every time there's some difficulty, God will get us out of the mess at the end of the day. He'll quench the power of the lion, or the flames, or will escape the sword. But the truth is that didn't happen all the time. And so the writer is very careful to also give us a list of examples of those who did not survive, physically speaking. See, sometimes the truth is, your faith doesn't always get you out of trouble. Sometimes your faith gets you into trouble. Think of Joseph, for example. He ended up in prison in Egypt, not because he'd done wrong, but because he'd been obedient to God. And sometimes your faith doesn't get you out of trouble. It's not always God's will, but humanly speaking, His people are delivered. It's a mystery to us sometimes, we understand that. There are many, many down through the years, not just in the biblical historical record, many in our own day today who are suffering appallingly for their faith under different regimes in our world today. And some of them are suffering, and there seems no end to their suffering, and many have suffered to the point of death, and God did not physically rescue them. So we need this balance here. It's not all positive in that sense. And so it reminded to us of the reality of faith. So great victories gained by faith, but here we have now great suffering endured by faith. Like we're told, some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so they might rise again to a better life. The implication is there that there were some people who actually had the opportunity to escape. If they just recanted, they just renounced their views, but they refused to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. That word better is one of the key words in Hebrews. Christian faith is so much better than everything these Jewish background believers had before. And raised to a better life is so much better than even continuing here in this world. And some would rather be tortured to the point of death for their faith than deny their faith and live longer. Again, about the story of Daniel, or Daniel's friends. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. And He will deliver us out of your hand, O King. All his friends had to do was bow down. They could have kept their fingers crossed behind their back. They could have said, we don't really mean this. But they didn't do it because that would have been denying God. They could have found an easy way out. And He will deliver us out of your hand, O King. But if not, be it known to you, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Here's the question. Maybe you're asking this question. What could be better than escaping death, or if killed, being raised back to life? That first of the group of examples. What could be better than that? Either escaping death, or if killed, being raised back to life. I'll tell you what's better than that, friends. It's dying, never having to die again, because you've been raised to eternal life. You know, remarkable miracles wrought even in Jesus' ministry. The widow of Nain I mentioned, Jairus' daughter, his dear friend Lazarus. But those guys all had 2 funerals, because they died and then they had to die again. Whereas if you died for the Lord in this way and don't come back to life, you just get to enjoy eternity. You don't have to endure a second funeral. What can be better than escaping death, or if killed, being raised back to life? Well, the answer is very simple. Dying never to die again. To be in that eternal, unbroken presence of the Lord. I was reminded this and did some reading this week. I'm always encouraged and humbled, and I encourage you to do this if you've never done it. I want you to encourage you to read some of the stories of the martyrs of the faith down through the years. There's a remarkable account. There's a great book called Fox's Book of Martyrs. Or read the stories of the Covenanters, so much closer to home here in Scotland. And they're humbling, challenging. Let me remind you of a couple of examples I just reminded myself of over the last days. Back in the 1600s, there was a guy called James Guthrie. He was described by Oliver Cromwell as this, a great testimony, the short man who would not bow. He was so strong in his faith that he would not bow and give in. He was tried on 6 charges and hanged in Edinburgh in 1661. Now remember the context here. These are those who refuse to accept release so they might rise again to a better life. And this is what he said as he went to the gallows. He said, I take God to record upon my soul, I would not exchange this scaffold with the palace and mitre of the greatest prelate in Britain. I shall not die, but live. 5 years later, it was the turn of a man called Hugh MacHale. And when he was captured, he refused to tell the names of others. And in order to get information out of him, he was tortured with a torture they used to use then called the boot. It was a very painful device in which a metal wedge was hammered against the leg bone. And he passed out from pain when the bone split, but he still did not give out the desired information. He was sentenced to death. He received no medical treatment. In fact, he literally, physically dragged himself up onto the scaffold for his hanging joyfully. And he was a 26-year-old Scotsman, eager to enter eternal life. And he told the crowd as he dragged himself up onto the scaffold, I care no more to go up this ladder and over it than if I were going home to my Father's house. Every step is a degree nearer heaven. They had the opportunity to escape. They had the opportunity to avoid the ultimate punishment, but they saw it as a fast track to glory. And of course, we need look no further for the greatest example. Just look a few verses later down in the book of Hebrews in chapter 12. Jesus. I know the parallel isn't exactly the same because he came back to life. His ministry, but look what we're told about him in chapter 12 and verse 2. Look into Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus went to the cross, knowing what was coming, knowing all the agony and the humiliation he was going to suffer, and he endured it, despising it, counting it as nothing, because he was looking to his reward. What a great example he is to us. I may have told you a story fairly recently, and I can't remember all the details, but I remember David Andrew telling me a story a few years ago about a man who was kidnapped, a Christian man who was kidnapped for his faith, and he was threatened with all sorts of things, and then ultimately when they got no results out of him, they said, well, we'll just kill you. And he said, you cannot threaten me with heaven. That's the great response, isn't it? Refuse to accept release so they might rise again to a better life. Then look what we're told in verse 36. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. And so the list goes on here. We know from the Bible that Stephen was stoned to death in Acts chapter 6. Paul, in one case, was stoned and left for dead, although God revived him. The tradition is that Isaiah, the Old Testament prophet, was almost certainly sawn in two. Very specific reference that we have here in Hebrews 11. And in all of these examples that we have here, in every situation, every sort of trial, these great examples of faith remain true to the Lord. So whether it's great faith accomplishing victory, or whether it's great faith enduring suffering, underneath it all is the same message and example. These great examples of faith remained true to the Lord. Now remember the situation being faced by those to whom the letter of the Hebrews is written. Life is tough. If you're a Christian and you're living in the Roman Empire in the days when this letter was written, life is tough and there's persecution, there's opposition. And you may lose your job and you may get kicked out of your family and all sorts of other things might happen to you. So let's just throw in the towel. Let's just go back to our old ways. Go back to Judaism when life was so much simpler. So the writer says, well, what kept these guys going? What kept the saints of old going? And the simple answer is they had faith. God was real to them. Do you know what we're told about Moses? I love this phrase. I've gone back to this often in my own thoughts. Back in chapter 11, verse 27. By faith, Moses left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king. Why? Because he endured as seeing him who is invisible. He saw past Pharaoh and he saw God. Pharaoh was standing toe to toe, nose to nose with him, but God was more real to Moses than Pharaoh was. Pharaoh could have kicked his fingers. Moses would have been fed to his pet crocodiles. Didn't care. God was more real to him than Pharaoh. That's what kept these saints of old going. They were certain that God was real, that God's word was real, that God's word was true, that what God said he would do, he did. What he said would happen, would happen. What he promised would be theirs, even if they never saw it in their own lifetime. Friends, I find these examples so humbling, because we live in a world, we live in a culture, particularly here today, I think, where we're so fixated on the visible and the material and the tangible and what we can hold on to. And these people gave all that up because they realized that was passing. What really matters is what you couldn't see, what you couldn't touch, what you couldn't lay hold of. That's what I read. Go back we began ourselves in Hebrews chapter 12. And you get this phrase. Let me find the exact words here. Verse 27, yet once more indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. See, we need to be like these Old Testament heroes of faith and fix our eyes on that which cannot be shaken. But there's such a conspiracy from the world, isn't there, to focus our eyes on things that can be shaken. Our health, our bank balance, our careers, our possessions, whatever it may be, that's where our security lies in so many cases. And what kept these people going was not where their security was. That was just a passing incident. Their security was in what they couldn't see. What they couldn't see. What was more real to them than that which they could see. Because they're in a right relationship with God. Now, before we look at the last teaching point in the last couple of verses of Hebrews, I want to deal with this issue of how we handle when persecution comes. Just very briefly, give you, I think, 3 points here. How do we deal when persecution comes? Because that's what this last little section has been about. And I think we need to be wise and realize that we've been immensely privileged for many generations now in this country, but that situation is changing. And in many parts of the world, it's the norm for Christians to suffer hideously for their faith. And who knows what may happen here in the UK in the next 10, 20 years. So what's the biblical principle? Let me give you 3 suggestions, I think, that might help us here. Number 1, avoid it if possible. Embrace it if you can't. And avoid it if possible, but embrace it if you can't. You know, even the Apostle Paul, on at least one occasion, he moved on, he slipped out of the city so that he wouldn't get persecuted. He wasn't a sort of masochist looking to get beaten up or killed. But we need to recognize that he said to Timothy, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 8, blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil things against you. For so persecuted they the prophets. There's a blessing that comes. But I don't believe anywhere in the Bible we're told to go looking for it. I don't believe anywhere in the Bible we're told to go provoking it, as if there's some godliness in that. You know, the gospel is offensive in and of itself, but many people, the truth is, many people are put off the gospel not by the offense of the message, but by the offense of the messenger and the way we speak it. Because there are some people, some Christian people, who are just out looking for a fight. Some Christians who relish in being opposed. Friends, I don't find any biblical warrant for that. We should preach the gospel faithfully, winsomely, lovingly, and if it brings opposition, it brings opposition not because we've caused the opposition, but because the message has caused the opposition. So number 1, avoid it if possible, embrace it if you can. Number 2, appropriate grace will always be supplied. I'm sure you wonder sometimes, if persecution comes to Scotland, persecution comes to the UK, how will we cope? We look at, maybe you don't, but I look at my small faith and think, how on earth will we cope? How we cope if we're put in the same situation as our brothers and sisters in North Korea, for example, or in Sudan? How will we cope? Well, the answer is we just don't know. But we don't need that grace at this moment in time. When we're in that situation, and we're faithful to the Lord will give us the grace that we need. The lovely verse in Deuteronomy 35, 33, I'm sure you know. As your days, so shall your strength be. Now you know, that's not only or even primarily about as long as you live, so shall your strength be. It's not so much the number of your days, it's the nature of your days. As your days, so shall your strength. On those days you need more grace, God will give you more grace. On those days you need particular grace, God will give you that particular grace. So when God brings us into times of testing and trial and opposition and suffering and persecution, He will give us what we don't need now. He'll give us the grace and strength for that particular situation. And number 3, bear this in mind. When we suffer for the faith, it's not us, but God that is hated. It's not us, but God that is hated. Remember, Jesus said to the disciples, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. Remember that dramatic picture in Revelation 12, which in many ways is the hinge of the whole book of Revelation, and explains the whole spiritual conflict between God and Satan. When the pregnant woman, who is the church of Old and New Testament, gives birth to Jesus Christ, and then he's taken up into heaven when he's ascended, Satan then turns his attack on the followers of the child. He can no longer get at Jesus, so he has a go at us instead. We're not being persecuted because we're worth persecuting. We get persecuted because we're representatives and followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. So if suffering and persecution comes in, avoid it if we can, embrace it if we can't. Appropriate grace will be given as needed, and it's not us that's hated, but God. Now let's look at the last 2 verses of Hebrews chapter 11. So we've seen the great victories gained by faith, great suffering endured by faith, and then I find these astonishing words in these last 2 verses, and I call this great reward awaited by faith. All these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. What astonishing truth. While all these great examples of faith saw many of the promises made to them fulfilled, we've seen that point already. The greatest promises made to them were not received before they died. We saw that some weeks ago, back in verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them, and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land to which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared for them a city. See, for these people the best was yet to come. In truth, it is a fact that even tonight as we meet here, for these people the best is still yet to come. They still have not received all that God promised them. Again, think of the context. These Hebrew believers in the New Testament days, they seemed to think the best was behind them. So they were tempted to return. And the writer says, no. All these examples of faith could have gone back if they wanted to. They could have gone back, but they didn't want to. People who speak like this make it clear they're seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking of the land from which they'd gone out, they would have an opportunity to return. But they didn't want to go back. They burned their bridges. They wanted to go forward. So he's saying, don't go back. That's to contradict all that these guys did in the past. Do you know, friends, we have seen far more than they ever saw. Because we live post-Calvary. We have thousands more years of Christian testimony and biblical revelation and all the work of God. But we are still waiting for what they are waiting for. Heaven itself. Just think about it. Adam has been waiting for the best part of 6,000 years. I find it hard to wait for 10 minutes. You know, Adam lived 6,000 years. Abraham's 4,000 years. Moses 3,500 years. David 3,000 years. Paul 1,000 years. Folk known to us, loved ones and friends who've gone before us, some of them waiting decades. They still haven't received. Oh yes, they're absent from the body, they're present with the Lord. Please don't misunderstand me, but the best is yet to come. They still only received part of the promise that God had made to them. They haven't got the resurrection of the body yet. They haven't got the new heavens and the new earth. They're in the presence of the Lord, but God has so designed it that we will only enjoy the fullness of heaven when our souls are reunited with our resurrected bodies, and this present earth is reconfigured and consumed in fire and recreated out of the fire, and everything is perfect in the new heavens and new earth. That's what they're waiting for. Your loved ones, my loved ones who died and gone to heaven, all the saints of all down all the way back to Adam, they're still waiting. They're still waiting. God is keeping these great heroes and heroines waiting. What is he keeping them waiting for? Us. Us. Look at what it says. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 40. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect or complete. Their enjoyment is partial at the moment. It's temporary. Their souls are with Jesus. And my friends, that's infinitely better than you and I have here on earth. I don't want to minimize that for a moment. But it's not the end. The best is still yet to come. And it's not going to happen till the Lord Jesus comes back, until he recreates the new heavens and new earth, and we get our resurrection bodies, and that's when we all enter into that reward. And we'll all be there at the same time. Adam will be there just when we're there. God's keeping them waiting for us. I find that astonishingly humbling. The question we need to ask ourselves this evening is, how real is heaven to me? How real is heaven to me? You've probably heard that old adage used to be said, some people are so heavenly minded they're of no earthly use. That's nonsense. It's exactly the opposite. You're no earthly use unless you're heavenly minded. That's what's true of these people. What made them so effective? What made them accomplish great things for God? What made them conquer kingdoms, enforce justice, obtain promises, stop the mouths of lions, quench the power of fire? That seems pretty earthly useful to me. What made them do that? Because they were heavenly minded. They were looking forward to that city, like Abraham, whose designer and builder is God. They designed a better country, a heavenly one. The more heavenly minded you are, the more earthly use you'll be. And the more heavenly minded we are, the more likely we will sit by those things that can be shaken. The things of this world. So this again is the great call to live by faith. So here's my challenge, my friends, to myself as well as to you. Don't, like these Hebrew background believers, look back over your shoulder. Look forward as you stand on the shoulders of these examples of faith. Don't look back. The best is yet to come. It's not behind you. How heavenly minded are we? How real is heaven to us? That seems to be the call of living by faith. In a moment we're going to sing a hymn, but I want to tell you a little bit about this hymn very briefly. It seems to be a very program to close with. It's an old hymn that has that chorus, "Oh, that will be glory for me." It was written by a guy called C.H. Gabriel, who was perhaps the best known gospel songwriter of the early 20th century. He's not particularly well known by name, but he wrote as many hymns as John Wesley did. That's about 6,500, by the way. One of his good friends was a guy called Ed Card. He was superintendent of a rescue mission in Missouri. A radiant believer, and it's written about him that he always seemed to be bubbling over with Christian joy. During a sermon or a prayer, he would often explode with glory, just like somebody would say, "Amen" or "Hallelujah." His retort was always glory, and his beaming smile earned him the nickname Old Glory Face. And it was his custom to close his fervent prayers with a reference to heaven, usually ending with the phrase, "And that will be glory for me." And so his friend Gabriel took that line and put it into this great hymn that he's written. And what a fitting song for the believer who has the assurance that he will someday be reunited with loved ones and with the Lord in heaven. Oh, that will be glory for me. Let me tell you something else, even more important. Oh, that will be glory for Jesus. Because even now, Jesus only receives partial worship, partial honor. But on that day, and only on that day, when every nation, tribe, people, and language are gathered around the throne, represented his throne, Only then will Jesus get the worship that is really due. And it'll be perfect worship, not limited by our limited understanding, our limited vocabulary and all the rest of it. Oh, that will be glory for me. Amen to that, but oh, that will be glory for Him. That day will be the day, probably the best day of worship in the whole of human history, because all God's purpose will be accomplished. And I trust that you know that you'll be there and that you're looking forward to it. So let's sing this great hymn as we close our worship this evening. When all my labours and trials are o'er, and I am safe on that